Looking at the things that are changing, I took a leap and said the first thing I want to address with everybody is the buy side. As far as listing agents, you're still talking pretty much the same. You're asking what you're going to have for a fee to reimburse not only the listing, but also the buy side. On the buy side, though, we've got new forms. We've got to package our purchase and sale agreements differently. And so what I've got lined out is I'm going to briefly go through the forms. Everything that's on the screen is going to be distributed with today. I have things underlined, highlighted on the actual contract forms. So I want to kind of go through them quickly. And then I'm going to focus on what I have as a cheat sheet, which is on an Excel spreadsheet that I've converted to PDF for when I send it out. And it's going to do two things. One, it's going to go over form 41, because that's the one that you're going to have to really memorize and know when you talk to a buyer. What that form does, it actually gives you the right to be compensated when a mutual happens and then at closing. If you do not have that form, then the only thing that's being paid to the buying broker is what was committed by the selling side, which is in the MLS. That's all that's going to be received. And so if you're looking at having a balance in case a seller says zero, that means you would get zero if you haven't got form 41 filled out and agreement in place with your buyer. That's how important that form is. Now, what it does, it addresses really two things. I'm only going to go through the section on form 41 for compensation. The other terms in there are very similar to the old form. In compensation, the two major areas is the seller's offer for compensation to the buyer broker equal to or greater than what you have an agreement with your buyer, one, or two, is what being offered less. When it's fun is when it's less, that means that your buyer has agreed to compensate you more than what the seller is offering, which means they have to make up the difference to compensate you. If they do not have the funds to do that, then there's mechanisms we're going to go over of saying, well, what are the different options that can go there? If it's under, is the buyer going to come up with the difference? Do they have the cash? If the answer is no, and they want to make an offer on this property, then you have to be creative, and you can either reduce your compensation as a broker, kind of sell yourself downward for what you're willing to get paid, or you can ask the seller in the purchase and sale agreement to pay the difference. Okay, or a combination of both. Now, if the payment from the seller is greater than what's being offered for the buyer broker's commission, with agreed to by the buyer and the buyer broker, then you have excess funds. So what happens to that? The thing that is nice about the way it's designed is that there's only 3 or 4 options. And in those options, when they're agreed, when you have that contract signed with your buyer, they're locked up. So you don't have to renegotiate that when that happens, when you have an offer, because you're either going to say, I'm going to revert the funds back to you, Mr. Buyer, for your use, or it just reverts to me as the broker for the services I'm providing automatically, or I'm going to give it to the seller to go back towards the selling price, or another, negotiate something different. Okay, so that's what you have to think about when you think about putting in form 41, and what we're going to think about when we write a purchase and sale agreement. So let me just start by doing a quick review of like what I just went over was in form 41. And as I mentioned earlier, all I want to do is talk about section 5. And in 5, this is where the compensation amount is either going to be a percentage of whatever the property is that's being purchased, or a set dollar amount, or if there's some other agreement that's been made between the buyer and buyer broker. Now, in compensation, it says may. It doesn't say shall. It says may. So the compensation may be offered by the seller in the MLS listing. And as I come down, if the seller offers of compensation is equal to or greater than the above amount, the buyer shall accept the seller's offer in compensation. So what I realized they're saying is that at closing, the escrow officer is dispersing the funds for the compensation directly to the broker for the sell side. But as we get lower, you'll notice the wording is that the compensation from the buyer side goes directly to the buyer and then from the buyer to the brokerage firm. Okay.
Just one more time. Okay. So the escrow company.
When we get down to the, I'll show you that when we get to the wording here. Let me just jump down here. If this equal to or greater, the buyer shall not be obligated to pay the buyer brokerage. The buyer shall accept the seller's offer of compensation, and the buyer shall not be obligated to pay the buyer brokerage firm. Any amount of compensation offered by the seller that is greater than the amount shall be paid to the buyer brokerage firm, credited to the buyer, and to the extent by the buyer's lender, any non-allowable amount shall be paid to the buyer brokerage firm. Or the other option is credit the seller, or we could negotiate. Maybe we negotiate a half goes to me and half goes to the buyer. Maybe that's a fair way of splitting anything that's over. But the key thing here is that it's that this seller, let's see, the buyers, let me find what we just talked about. Shall be stated in the purchase and sale agreement. Okay, right there, accepted by the buyer. In the purchase and sale agreement, such offer of compensation, if any, may be accepted by the buyer on behalf of the brokerage firm. That's what I'm mentioning right there. Okay. And the firm in the purchase and sale agreement and shall be applied to the buyer's compensation obligation in this agreement. But if you don't have an agreement, then it doesn't. There's nothing there to transfer. You don't have an agreement with the buyer. Okay. So this section right here is saying an awful lot in a short period of time. And this is where I was trying to make sense of compensation and how to fill out the purchase and sale agreement. Now, the one thing I want to point out is something that Lauren and I have been going around, and also I've been doing research with Northwest MLS. It says here that if the seller's offer of compensation is less than the above amount, the buyer shall accept the seller's offer of compensation, if any, and pay the balance of the compensation to the buyer brokerage firm at closing, or in the purchase fails due to the buyer's breach in terms of the purchase and sale agreement, no later than 5 days following such breach, the buyer shall be credited with any earnest money paid to the buyer brokerage firm. This is, I'm sorry, but I think it's very poorly written. Does anybody here tell me what that means? Lauren and I have been going around and around with it.
Isn't it just if the buyer breaches the contract, they get their earnest money back? Let me read it again.
If the buyer breaches the contract in the purchase and sale agreement, in the purchase and sale agreement, the default goes to the seller. Correct?
Yes.
If there's a breach of this contract, then do we get compensated anything? There's nothing in this agreement talks about default and termination of that contract and what consequences in any prescriptive way describe what happens to the buyer broker side. But just to help clear up the mud puddle, what I did is I started researching, and here's a question that was turned into the hotline. Is there is less, the purchase statement fails due to the buyer's breach, okay? And so this is asking the question, what happens during the breach? And so what I was concentrating on is this answer. The form provision is addressing a scenario where the buyer breaches the agency agreement and also defaults on the purchase and sale agreement. If buyer defaults on a PSA, buyer may be forced to forfeit the earnest money. That's the way the purchase and sale agreement's written. If buyer forfeits earnest money and that same buyer owes damages to the buyer broker firm, buyer will get credit for the earnest money received by the broker against the money buyer owes to the buyer brokerage firm as a result of the buyer's breach.
Now, but
Now, that doesn't make any sense to me
First
either,
of all,
because there's nothing in the contract on 41 or 40C in the contract with the buyer that says anything that I'm entitled to if this is a breach. It's quiet, it's silent, it's not addressed. So I don't understand.
Even though we legally can, we and the vast majority of other brokerages do not touch earnest money, right? That goes directly to
So
escrow.
usually handled by escrow, it's not held by a trust account
Yeah.
by the buyer's brokerage firm.
So this is.
So there
this
isn't anything
should
there.
be- This should be a moot point for us, but.
It
but
should be.
in the example, if we were holding in earnest money, yeah, this is a big cluster because,
Okay.
you know, the money's supposed to go back to the seller and the vast majority of all contracts are going to have that money going to the seller
Going to
if
the
the
seller.
buyer breaches the contract.
Correct. And there's nothing in writing anywhere that we have a relationship that says we get anything.
Yeah, so basically we don't get anything and
Well,
that
this-
earnest money
that-
is a credit to the buyer.
And that's why this even, here's what the example even goes in, says example, let's say that buyer's compensation to the brokerage would have been $3,000, except the buyer breached the PSA. In that case, the firm's damages would be $3,000. So what it's saying is, if I was supposed to get $3,000 worth of compensation out of the purchase and sale agreement in the agreement, then I'm owed that. However, if I forfeit the EM to the seller, any portion of the earnest money was shared with by buyer's brokers firm, then buyer would get credit for that amount of the earnest money already paid to the buyer brokerage firm. I don't see how that works out either, because if the earnest money is $1,000 and $1,000 goes to the seller,
just shorting
where's there's
buyer
leftover
brokerage
money
firms.
coming back to us?
Yeah.
So anyway, this isn't going to just go away easily. I think there's going to be a ton of questions like that one. Lauren and I have been talking about trying to write another question about how to try and get through this, because I've got some drafts on it. And as we learn more about that particular clause, we'll bring it to you. So I don't want to go down the rabbit hole on that, but I wanted to point out there's things that are pretty rough that still need to be cleared up.
And we don't red line or strike through anything in contracts, but if we did, that would be a good candidate.
Please
I know we don't do
don't
that.
encourage people.
We
to
don't do that.
No,
Ever,
no,
but
I know.
if you did,
Okay. So the other quick review is on Form 21. I think everybody's seen this up on the screen before. This is what gets filled out, is the buyer brokerage firm compensation. You either check a box on dollar amount or percentage amount. It depends on what you have in your Form 41 contract with the buyer and the seller. This one here is then filled in, and you're either going to say pay as offered. And when pay as offered, it's only talking about the seller's compensation side.
Yeah.
Okay. This is not talking about the buy side. This is just the seller side.
what they offer to the buyer brokerage firm.
And it says, or other, see addendum. So those are our two options to be able to check. And the only other thing I'd like to point out is that on
It's W, I think. Or you,
you,
yeah.
the way this is changed on item U is if there is no agency agreement in place and you have no compensation coming from the buyer side, this clause guarantees you that you will receive by filling in item 16. You've got to fill that in. If you fill that in and check it, then you're guaranteed to get the seller's amount that was in the MLS listing.
But they have to match up. If there's a discrepancy between what you write in there and what the MLS offers, it defaults to what the MLS offers.
And that default is described in the section. So when you get a chance, you just want to read that. That's how you know you're getting paid on the seller side.
Yeah, and I would say in item 16, you should always have 2 check marks, right? So you should always check whether that's a dollar amount or a percent. In most cases, it's going to be a percent.
Got to have
And
that.
then you got to have that check mark, and then you got to check either pay as offered or see other C addendum, and that's going to be your 41C.
Yes.
Okay.
When you,
Yes.
and this is what you're going to see when I go into the matrix, is that if the offer from the seller is more than what your agreement is with the buyer, then you don't need a Forms 41C. So you would check the box, pay as offered.
Hmm.
Okay,
Pay as offered?
pay as offered.
But I thought you just said that was only pay as offered goes to the selling.
It's only
Okay,
what the
wait,
selling
okay.
side is offering to the
Oh.
buyer
But
broker.
remember, you have two agreements in place. The seller says, I'm going to give you 4 units.
Mhm.
I negotiated with my buyer saying, okay, for all the buy, I'll pay you 2 units.
Mhm.
So 4 is greater than 2. So I'm going to see more come in than what the buyer said they're going to pay me.
And so that's when you put pay as offered.
Check
So
the box, pay
pay
as offered.
whatever the selling,
Yep.
seller's offer.
And you don't need a Form
And
41C.
that's why that tiny print says amount offered in listing, only put what they put on the MLS in there. And then if you have more coming to you from the buyer side, check that other.
Okay,
see addendum.
I have a
So-
question when you're done.
okay. So if the seller says, I'm going to give you 2 units, because I can't use dollars because of collusion.
Yeah.
So let's say he gets 2 units and your buyer says, I'm going to pay you 4. Well, now I need Form 41C to find out how I'm going to be able to deal with that. And so that's when I would check the box, pay the compensation offered, but see addendum. And again, I have a matrix for each of these situations, and that's where I want to get to. I don't want to get hung up right here. Yeah, what was the question? Is that Ashley? Did you have a question?
Yeah, I think I might have figured out. So let's say they're paying 2%. Sorry, I'm gonna say percent city units. So I can fill in on 16, check the percentage box. And if they're
Right.
offering 2%, then I fill in 2% because it says amount offered in listing.
And
I
that-
don't
and it comes
understand
out
why
the
I-
MLS.
So I can't understand why I can't just put that. I guess, I mean, I think it's kind of, okay, I guess I just always have to select pay as offered. You
If-
confused me, yeah, when you kind of said
No,
the
no.
seller side.
So actually, if you say 2%, that's what's in the MLS that the seller is contributing.
Yes,
And so
and if I'm
Depending-
happy with that,
if the buyer amount is more than that, then just say pay as offered. You just pay as offered the 2%. If it's less, if let's say this is 2% this here and the buyer offered you 1%, there's provisions for you to get the other 1% and be paid. To do that, you have to have the addendum 41C attached.
okay,
Okay?
So if there's
So
an
let's-
overage.
Yeah, so that's what this is confusing because
well, let's
There
just
isn't
do
this is a working example to go through, and I want to get to doing that.
okay,
Yeah,
never
It'll
mind.
make a difference, okay? Because on this 41C, what it does, it says, if the compensation for the firm in the MLS is 0, then I check the box, offer of compensation from seller to buyer brokerage firm in the listing, or seller has not signed a listing agreement, one of those two, seller shall pay buyer brokerage firm compensation of X%. So that's how I get my other 1%, is try and see if the seller will pay it because the buyer's not paying it. So if seller offers 2%, and let me get this straight. If the buyer is offering you 2% and the seller offers 0, I need to come up with 2% somewhere. And so by checking this box and putting 2% in, when you turn in your purchase and sale agreement, that offer is saying, not only I'm saying X amount of dollars for the house, but also X amount of dollars to go towards the buyer brokerage firm.
So this is a part of your negotiation
With the seller, correct,
So
with the seller.
you, not only are you negotiating for your client, you're also negotiating for your paycheck.
There are 2 negotiations going on, that's
Okay.
right. And,
That makes
and that's why on this form, it's very important, right up here in the top, the following is part of the purchase and sale agreement dated. This is an addendum to, just like a form 22A or 22T or a 22D. This one here is a 41C and is part of the package of the contract. Okay. So that's how that's addressed. It also says additional buyer brokerage firm compensation, buyer representation agreement. In this one here, what's going to the seller saying buyer is obligated to pay the buyer brokerage firm compensation as a condition of the buyer representation agreement between the buyer brokerage firm and the buyer. Seller offered of a compensation to the buyer brokerage firm in the listing is less than the buyer's obligation to buyer brokerage firm. Accordingly, seller agrees to pay buyer brokerage firm additional compensation of X of the purchase and sale, or this amount of dollar at closing. Buyer brokerage firm's total compensation by seller shall be. So this is where, yeah, let's say I need 4% from the buyer and the seller only offered 2%. This is where I said I want the other 2%. And we're negotiating with the seller to pay it as a part of the sale. It come out of their net of that sale after the closing with the escrow agent. That's where it's getting paid. Now, let's say that the seller or the buyer doesn't have the money and the seller, and you're going back and forth, they return and reject your purchase and sale agreement. The other option you might have is that, oh, we'll credit the buyer. So the buyer's brokerage firm's compensation shall be reduced from the amount offered in the listing by so many dollars, and the seller of this, okay, I got this one. This is where in the agreement that we just looked at previously, there's an option for any overage to go back to the seller.
Who wrote this garbage?
A
Well-
select team of attorneys.
Well,
I say it has to be attorneys.
Yeah.
They are. They're attorneys. Let's see, where's my other form? I'm looking for one. I'm missing a form. Where is it? Okay. Okay. Okay, I'm looking for a 41. Where? 40, there it is. Where? I got a form hiding down here somewhere. I'm trying to find it.
Which form are you looking for?
41.
Form 41, buyer agreement. But that was the one on the right-hand side.
There's 41C. You got too many things open here. I'm
Show up
trying
on your other screen.
I don't know. I'm shopping on my other screen right now.
It's there.
I don't see it. All right, I have a false fail safe here. Let me get to it.
We'll take a short commercial break.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no kidding.
Well, while Tom's looking for
Gotta
that, I will
laugh.
say that what they're doing is good in the sense that it gets us ahead of changes that are probably going to happen at a federal level eventually. So I like that. How they're doing it is not my favorite.
So what, because I pretty much have taken the last 3 months off and haven't paid attention to
Yeah.
a team meeting at
Mhm.
all.
Got
And
it.
17 years of experience, and now I feel like I am representing a buyer essentially, potentially for free, or making my buyer pay for my time, which our time is valuable, period.
Yes.
Doesn't matter who's paying for it. So what's the script when you're in a listing appointment?
Okay, but
Do you bring this garbage up?
You
or
have-
do just
no, you
go in
have-
And say, I want 3 and 3, and that's the way it's gonna be.
well, it's your choice. You have to develop a relationship with your buyer and get an agreement in place. But if you have a purchase and sale agreement and they want to buy a house and you haven't talked to them about how you're getting paid, that's an awkward position. So it's nice to do it like when you're doing the agency law discussion.
Right,
Now,
That's when you go over, all
Now
the
this-
financing options, you're proving your value to them upfront.
sure,
And so it's just folding this into the conversation you're hopefully already having.
okay,
but
so
if
I
you're.
want to get back, on
Okay.
track because there's a lot I want to cover. I found the form. The reason I'm bringing this up is because it says if the seller's offer of compensation is equal to or greater than the above amount, okay. Buyer shall accept the seller's offer of compensation. Buyer shall not be obligated to pay the buyer broker firm any amount of compensation offered by the seller that is greater than the above amount shall be, which is very poorly written, but it's basically saying that if there's more being offered, the buyer can keep it. You have an agreement for 2%, you get 2%. There's no obligation of the buyer to give you the other 2%. They can keep it. Unless you check the box when you're negotiating this agreement with the buyer saying, no buyer, anything over will be paid to the brokerage firm. Okay. Or you check the box, credit to the buyer, but there's a proviso to the extent allowed by the buyer's lender. And any non-allowable amount shall be paid to the buyer brokerage firm. Or the choice is credit to the seller. And tell it credit to the seller, because you're doing a purchase and sale agreement that isn't mutual yet, you're telling the seller that, hey, we're kicking this back to you, seller, and this goes towards the purchase price of the house. It helps them to buy the house. Or there could be another, and in the other, this is where the buyer and you say, well, if there's something over, okay, you want some of it, but some of it should come to me. So maybe we negotiate a 50-50 split, or we negotiate something else. Be very, very careful if you do that, because if it goes to them directly and it's rejected by the lender, you have a problem. So you must have that language if you negotiate added to your agreement. Now, and I have that covered somewhere else. So in review of this form, this is where credit to the buyer comes from, is from that clause, go to the seller. That's when you use this box. And then last but not least, you're a charity and you decide that you want to compensate by trying to make the deal work by giving some of your commission back to the buyer. Now, how does this all fit together? This is where I want to go today. This is where I want to spend the bulk of our time. Because what I've done is I have developed 2 spreadsheets for you. If I can find them. Oh my God. I closed it out by accident. Here we go. This is the most recent one now and there. Okay. That's not the correct form. Let me get the correct form up. There we go. And the 2 forms that I've tried to line out, this is form 41, which we just reviewed. And the way that this will show you is that every line in the contract that I found something that you need to know, instead of trying to stare at that contract, is to have a place that tells you what's going on with item 5, starting out with the May seller's compensation. This is the area that I had a problem with. And that is the area that I had the questions and answers from the hotline. I don't believe they answered it to the extent that's understandable. So I'm going to keep working on that. But I'll have this printed out and given to you. We just reviewed that contract. So what I want to do is go to form 41C. And in 41C, I'm trying to write some examples. And in these examples, there's 41, 41C, 21. This is where we're filling out a purchase and sale agreement. And where we're going to fill in when it says line 18 on that form 21. As an example one, as I'm saying, when a purchase and sale agreement, when buyer and seller offer compensation are equal, 10 units from the seller and 10 units to pay the buyer brokerage firm. That means when they're equal like that, then you would check the box, pay as offered. And form 41C is not included in this purchase and sale agreement. You don't need it. That's because over here in the seller column, I'm saying that seller's offering 10 and the buyer is paying you 10 and they're equal. That's the easiest one. Example 2, I have A, B, and C because I wanted to have a demonstration of what happens when you go and you get a counter offer from the seller and you make a counter offer back to the seller. In this case, the buyer has, the seller offers no buyer broker compensation in the MLS, 0. So seller's offered 0 and the buyer obligation to pay. So the buyer has an obligation of 10 units to me and the seller isn't offering anything. So if I'm going to go to form 21, I will check the box other, see addendum, and then I will attach. I'll attach the 41C to the PSA. And then on form 41C, I'll be saying on line 5, check the box for buyer brokerage firm's compensation, no compensation offered by seller. And fill in the blanks on the form. Buyer can ask for all or a portion of the obligation. Okay. So if in this example, there's 10 that's owed to me from the buyer, I can ask for the 10 or I can ask for a 5. I can ask for whatever you want. This is going in as the purchase and sale agreement for both buying the house as well as buying and paying for the broker fee. So in this instant, if I do that, I ask for all 10 in this example. And in asking for all 10, the seller can count. So that's what I put a 10 over there. Now on form F36 seller counter offer, the seller countered offering to pay half. So now I have an offer of half over here. So in this particular instance, if that ends up being mutual, then I would get 5 and I'd be 5 less than what I had an agreement with the buyer. The buyer would still owe me the other 5 because that's the contract that I have with them. Okay. So then I say, in this case, the buyer probably wouldn't sign the purchase and sale agreement. What we do is we have an obligation of 10. In this example, a buyer cannot afford 5 units, so the buyer broker may decide to reduce the agency agreement of obligation in order for the buyer to get mutual. So a new form 36 is filled out and an offer of half of the obligation is owed. And so in this case, I would check the box to agree with what the seller offered. And then on the next box down, I would say, check the other box for C, attach 41C. Okay. Now on 41C, I'm going to write out a new 41C. And this is the way to keep things clear, is the old 41C you turned in is no good. It wasn't accepted. Fill out a new one because you now will be checking more than one box on the 41C. Where's 41C?
That's the second one.
So I'm saying here, make it big enough for everybody to read. Say, Ashley? Are you still there? Courtney?
Yeah, I'm still here.
Yeah, I was curious, when you're on your screen, can you see these forms and read them okay?
Yeah,
Okay. Because what I'm saying is on line 5, and here's line 5, is I would check that for buyer brokerage firms compensation because there is no offer of compensation by the seller. So they already agreed to pay 5, so I put 5% in here. And then down here on 41C, line 23, here's 23, reduction of buyer's brokerage firm compensation. I deduct buyer's obligation of offering 2.5. So maybe I'm not going to say I'm going to give all of it back to the buyer, but maybe just portion of it back to the buyer. And then by doing that, by saying not just, okay, we'll go 2.5, then what that means is I have 5 over here. This now in this offer back to the seller. The seller now sees that the buyer brokerage firm is throwing 2 and 2.5 units back into the deal and see if they'll sign and go mutual on that. Okay, now what that means is that I had a contract for 10, I now have 7.5 covered. That would mean that the seller or the buyer would now have to come up with the other 2.5 to meet this contract. Okay,
Or do you renegotiate with your buyer?
that's a whole nother topic on another forum, but you could. If you wanted to make that deal go away completely. But why not just say?
But it has to be on that purchase and sale. and it has
If you
to be
did that, then
seller
you'd
knowledge.
be putting a 5 there instead of a 2.5 if you want to do that. So you're talking to your buyer, can you give me something? They say, yeah, I can give you, maybe I can get 2.5. Then you say, okay, I'll reduce my 2.5 and let's make a deal. Okay. So this is the kind of stuff that's going on back and forth, okay?
Tom, this is
Yes.
Deborah. So
Yeah.
what you're saying is that we're in the middle of the sandwich. We're negotiating with both the buyer and the seller?
Yes, we
I mean,
are.
of course,
Well, no, the negotiation with the buyer is over. Now we're negotiating with the seller. But we are
Oh.
we're still
yeah,
trying to help our buyer come up with what they owe us
by
always-
going back to the seller.
by going back to the seller. And maybe reducing ours and then, but they got to come up with the rest. There's only 3 places the monies can come from the buyer, the seller, and the broker to meet that
Yep.
10. Okay.
Yep.
And so.
Yep. Okay, thank
Now-
you. I think.
You bet. You bet. I don't know if it's thank you or not, but this is, but I really want this. I had to go through this so many times in the last week or so, trying to come up with this thing to say, how can I walk you through what you and I and the rest of us will be doing, depending on how things are structured with the MLS offer from the seller versus what our buyer says they're going to pay us. This is the real world. So I'm going to come down and say, I'm going to make another variable. The buyer broker may offer a reduction in the amount compensation on 41 agreement. The buyer is obligated to pay 10 units. The seller offer is 7 units and it's less than the buyer obligation. So this is kind of, I'm still trying to do back and forth here a little bit, but in this particular instance, I'm saying buyer cannot afford 3 units. So buyer may decide to see if seller will contribute to the buyer's obligation in order to get mutual. So in this particular example, the seller says 7, the buyer has a contract with me with 10. They only can come up with 7. The seller has 7 and they don't have enough for the 3. So this is a different situation. Instead of the seller offering 0, the seller actually in the MLS is offering 7. So there's not the other form quite the way it was filled out before. So in this particular instance, we would be looking at, instead of this box, we're now into the form of checking this box, additional buyer brokerage firm compensation, buyer representation agreement. And so in this particular situation, see if I can make it a little bigger for everybody. Buyer is obligated to pay buyer brokerage firm compensation as a condition of the buyer representation between buyer brokerage firm and the buyer. Seller offer of compensation to the buyer brokerage firm in the listing is less than the buyer's obligation to the buyer brokerage firm. Accordingly, seller agrees to pay buyer broker firm additional compensation of 3 or 1 or 1.5 or whatever we agree to. Because this, again, we're still in negotiations here, but why not ask for all of it and see if they counter back, something different. Or that amount of money. Buyer brokerage firm's total shall be here. So we're checking that box is what we're doing here. That's what this example is about. So,
Tom,
yes.
I get- Anna Marie Dolby's got her hand up.
Oh, Anna Marie, what you got?
Sorry, didn't want to just chime in. Is it my understanding of all this? I'm getting way confused, but we now have to have a buyer broker agreement stipulated before we take out. I mean, I do that, but I always say per MLS. Do we have to have something where we say you're going to pay me X amount irregardless?
Yes, well,
I mean, because I always say per MLS,
If-
is it no longer, is that what's changing? The drastic change is they are
Well-
telling the sellers, you don't have to pay your buyer. I know that's been there, but.
you
I
will,
still see
you
a
will,
buyer-
you will, if the listing, MLS listing for compensation to buyer on the MLS is 0,
Uh-huh.
and
That's.
you
what-
don't have it, you don't have this agreement, you don't get paid.
Exactly. Okay, I don't show those properties, but.
Well,
There's,
technically, that's what
don't
they call
say,
filter.
don't say that out loud because in that, that's a,
There is a provision for that in 41.
Yeah.
Don't say
41.
that.
I'm just private. I'm just private. I'm sorry. spoke Outside my head.
I'll accept your apology.
Yeah.
That's good.
Okay.
There's language in Form 41 where you and your buyers can agree to filter listings, but it has to be an agreement between you
That-
and your buyer.
And that's true. What Lauren just said is, Anna Marie, you could reach an agreement with your buyer that you would not bring those kind of listings to their attention. They may ask you to say that's okay. And
Well,
then
that's what I do. I don't arbitrarily, but I do say,
Yeah.
listen, I'm going to put per MLS agreement. This is what, I have. I'm going to get paid by the commission of the MLS.
right.
But to protect myself, we say Okanagan County, Douglas County, Chelan, whatever I'm working with. But if the properties have 0, do you want to see them? And no, because they don't want to pay. They've barely got enough money there.
Well,
Okay,
that's part of your negotiation here too, is that by them not having something on the buy side offered to you, we can't do this, because the more that they put down, the more opportunity there is for trying to swing a deal with the seller to chip in on the delta and the difference. So, but back to the example.
yes.
But Anna Marie, is you okay? Your answer okay?
No, that's fine. I was just like, okay, now I have to buyer broker agreement specify, I will not take you out unless you pay me 5 or 3 or 1 or 2 or whatever it is, as opposed to me just saying per MLS.
Well, and what you're telling the buyer is that you may not have to pay all of that compensation to me if there's a situation where the seller offers more or the same, or even if it's a little bit less, there's still other ways of trying to close that gap for you. If we cannot, then we just keep looking at houses and make an offer on another property.
Okay,
That's how it's going to have to be. Now, in this example, I have where the seller has offered 7 units, and I have a contract. The buyer owes me 10. I'm short 3. So that's where I go to say, check the other box, see other and see form 41C. And I attach 41C to the other addendums in my purchase and sale agreement. And then on form 41C line 9, and let me see if I can. Oh, I want to get rid of that one right now. Where's 41C?
Second, no, next one down.
That one?
That one. Yeah.
There we go. So what did I say? I'm hitting line 9. And so what I try to do in this matrix to make it something that you can go back and walk through, when you have that situation on line 9, I would be checking additional brokerage firm compensation, buyer broker representation. And then I would decide what percentage or unit I would put in there. And in doing that, line 9, I would say buyer tells buyer broker they can afford 1 unit. So fill in the blank in form 41, 13 and 14 seller contribution, say 2 units. So what that means is I'm writing an offer for the seller to contribute 2 units and the buyer is agreed to 1 unit. Okay. So in this account, if that went mutual, then the sellers agreed to pay 9 units, the buyers agreed to pay 1, the total is 10, and it meets the contract amount of 10.
So you're, but why
I
did
wanna
the
walk through
buyer
this
agree
because I
to
wanna-
pay 10 if he's not able to?
He just did, because we got a mutual where the 2 was accepted by the seller to pay 2 extra. They already had 7 in the MLS, so they're gonna pay 9, which means the buyer that came up with 1 unit throws that in, and the total is 10 units that now that contract is met for the buyer.
But under your thing, buyer's obligated to pay 10 units up on top. Why did he sign that contract to begin with?
Because the obligation is to get the 10, and there he is, we received the 10.
Okay, I guess I'm confused. Before you took them out, you say my fee is 10%. I'm only gonna get it from the seller or I'm gonna get it from you.
Out of this deal, we're gonna get 10%.
Okay. All right,
And they're trying to do everything you can to get to that 10%,
exactly.
10 units.
10 units. You with me?
With you.
Okay, because remember, the seller is only contributing on the buy side. On this side, that's whatever that is going to go against what your contract is with the buyer. Example 3. Let's say, all right, what happens when the purchase and sale agreement, when the seller offers a small buyer broker compensation in the MLS, and the buyer has to make up the difference to pay the buyer brokerage firm. So the seller offer will not cover buyer's obligation. So we're in form 16 or 21, we hit 16, have the addendum, we're going to need a 41C. And the buyer tells the listing broker firm they can come up with 2.5 units at closing and need help in order to get mutual on this deal. So in form 41, item 5, line 22, that if that's in the agreement and checked, let me try and go back to form 41. And we're saying on line 22, that this is the amount that's right here. That's where that number comes from. 5 compensation. So out of that agreement, we check on 41C, line 23. Come down to 23. Brokers firms compensation shall reduce the amount offered in the listing by X%. Purchase price offered by the buyer reflects this reduction in compensation owed to the buyer brokerage firm. And so in this particular one here, this means that's going to impact 2.5%. And then I would check line 23. Well, that was in the agreement. This is check the box for reduction of firm for the compensation to minus 2.5. So I'm taking 2.5 away from the 10. So I have 2.5 now, and I have 5 from the seller. If I add those two together with the 2.5, I get 10.
And you're saying at closing, 2.5 of that would go back to the buyer. in
Yep.
Credits.
Yep, credit.
Okay. So you're really, the takeaway is 7.5, but that's
That's
an unsettlement statement.
so trying to run those examples through on that side of the compensation where it's over or where it's under, where there's absolutely nothing. what I've done here is I've said the following example are for situations where the seller offer of compensation is more than the buyer's obligation to pay the broker service. So Form 41 agency agreement predetermines multiple options on how the overage funds will be distributed. So there's, what it did is eliminated, say now I'm in a purchase and sale agreement with this not mutual yet with the seller. I don't have to go back and renegotiate with the buyer now because we pre-negotiated, this predetermined, this is what's going to happen with what's over, okay? So if the box was checked for paid to buyer broker, you do this way. Then what would happen is I would not attach a 41C to the purchase and sale agreement. I don't need to. I can say just pay as listed, okay? Because this, whatever the seller's given is, it's over. So we got it coming in from the seller. We got 10 coming in from the seller. The obligation for the buyer is 5. So we're over by 5. And depending on what box was checked on our 41, item 5, it was checked the box for paid to buyer brokerage firm. If you remember, that was, there's 41. Here's 41. So what we're saying is when we negotiated the agreement with the buyer on 41, they checked the box paid to buyer brokerage firm because that was there, it's automatic. And that means that if we had 5 here at closing, we're going to get the additional 5 and we'll receive the full 10. Now, that means you did a great job negotiating with that buyer that if it's over, you'll get that. But you know what, if it turns out that our normal compensation is 2.5 or 3 and they made you agree to 1.5, well, I'll tell you what, if it comes in over, that should come to me.
Darn right.
Okay, and that's what you're trying to negotiate, to have them check that box, right?
So
Okay.
wouldn't you? This is just mind blowing to me right now.
Well, it is mind blowing, and that's why I wanted to blow your mind today, because the next time we come back, we can kind of go through it again. Because it has to sink in. I have been playing around with this since June,
But like,
trying to
what's-
figure
what's
this stuff
the-
out.
What's the script to a seller? Do you change your
I-
script?
To this, yeah, well, that was last week. We did all, that's all
I
we
know,
concentrated.
I'm
Okay, so I don't want to go backwards today. I want to go forward today. I want to get through this to see how we can get our brain wrapped around writing offers today. But yes, you do have to change your
Well, do we
scripts.
just take the month of October off and then this all gets rewritten because it doesn't make sense and then come back in November?
No, because I've been talking to the lawyers and writing questions for the hotline, and it all makes sense to them. So it has to make sense to us.
I believe in the end, with the way things are right now, we're gonna have to find a way to help the buyers. So when you're talking to the
Can you,
seller,
wait, if you're gonna do that, can you come up here so the people on Zoom can hear you? Come on,
You're on stage now.
Mr. Ruiz, here we go.
well, I've been thinking about what could be happening on the next weeks, and I feel like I'm just gonna bring the seller really quick, just to paint a scenario, right? Let's say that I got a listing. I told my seller that, changes are coming. If we cover at least 4% commission, I'm willing to take 2.5 at the least, and then help the buyer. Now, on the buyer side, whenever I write this agreement, I know they're hurting with the interest rates and then all the money they have to put down. I'm gonna have, for me, what I'm thinking is, I'm gonna have to figure out if I go as high as 2% for them to cover me,
Okay,
So, and,
so where you're going with this is where the next discussion needs to happen.
okay,
We need to figure out how to fill out the form. That's why
Uh-huh.
we have short time today.
Yeah.
We've got to get in the brain where it starts clicking that there's a direct relationship between 41 and 41C,
Mhm.
when to use it, not use 41C, when you're filling out a purchase and sale agreement, and get your brain around that. If your buyer is short for what the compensation is supposed to come to you, that you have to know that you can have a box you can check and attach to the purchase and sale agreement to ask the seller to pay your difference.
Mhm.
Or you can check that box for a portion of it and check a box where you're going to reduce part of your fee. And you need to get those strategies in your mind of how to use these forms.
Exactly.
That's what I'm trying to do today.
Uh-huh.
Now, we talked about what's our value proposition last week,
Mhm.
but now we have to start talking about negotiation strategies for your services at the same time as negotiating for your buyer with the broker for the seller and the seller. These things are now both going on simultaneously. Those discussions you just mentioned are exactly what we have to talk about in here.
Yeah.
But let me get through this
No,
first,
yeah.
then we'll hit that, because it's
Exactly.
very important how we address that when we say, if we sit down to write that offer. Because you'll know what the seller is offering, you know what your agreement is with the buyer, you see what house they're looking at, they want to write an offer on. That's where we really have to look at how we're going to package that initial offer, because it's going to be countered. Most offers are always countered, but they're not only going to counter the purchase and sale agreement for the house, they'll be counter offering whether you're asking them to pay money or not. Okay. So this portion of it's pretty easy, because this scenario and the next examples are where the seller offered more than what the buyer agreed to you to have. So there's overage. And this first example, you negotiated where if there's anything over, because I really should have been getting 10 units, but I agreed to 5 units with you. And all of a sudden this is over and that other 5 comes to me. That's what I normally work for. And this works out equitably for me. I took the risk with you and this now it works for me. That's that scenario there. Okay. And so in this matrix, when you get this, because every form that's up here today, I'll be emailing out to everybody. But with them underlined and back, when you lay them out like I do on a table, and this is what the handout looks like that you'll get. It is everything that's up on the screen that's written there. You can kind of come down and say, is it over or under? You can use these boxes on the right-hand side to see where I'm at. That you're in that scenario now. That's where you are. And these are the forms and the lines on the forms that you need to look at and check when you make your purchase and sale agreement. So because your obligation for your fiduciary responsibility, as well as the duties to standards of a lawyer, is picking the right form and then filling it out correctly. And so I'm trying to lay this back out to try and get ahead of this, because the first time you write out your first offer, this is going to be really important. After you get to 6 months from now and written 10, 15, or 20 offers, and you'll get into a rhythm. You won't need this stuff anymore. But right now, I think this is the only way I can see get jump started. Okay. So that's a scenario where the overage ended up being beneficial for the broker to be compensated 10 instead of 5. So I wrote another example because I'm trying to use the forms all the way through. Is during the purchase and sale agreement, when the seller offers more buyer broker compensation, the MLS, the seller has to distribute the overage per the terms of the buyer firm's agency agreement. Seller offers 10 units, buyer 5 units. So this is what happens if the buyer and you negotiated that anything that's over is going to be credited to the buyer. And so automatically that's what's going to happen. And so in that case, that's on form 41. So that's why I put this over. So you can go back to form 41, look at item 5A, line 30 and 31, and you can read it. That's the box that's checked. Then on the purchase and sale agreement, line 16, you're going to say pay as offered. You can accept it. And then on 41C, line 16, you're going to fill in the blanks for the amount of the reduction, which equals to the amount of the overage, 5 units. And the buyer lender determines the amount that's acceptable. So let's go to 41C, line 16. 41C, here's line 16 right there. Credit to the buyer. So the buyer brokerage firm's compensation shall be reduced from the amount offered in the listing by certain percent. The seller shall credit such amount to the buyer's obligations at closing. Okay. If buyer is obtaining a loan or loans to purchase the property, the seller's credit to the buyer is subject to the buyer lender's approval of such credit. Any amount not approved by the buyer's lender shall be paid to the buyer brokerage firm. Buyer brokerage firm's total compensation paid to the seller shall be at the X percent of sales or the dollar amount of sales at closing, not including any credit amount not approved by buyer's lender. So if you negotiate before you start showing houses, then it's going to go back to your client. Anything that's over, you're going to be happy with the commission you get from them. So anything that's over that, you can have back. If they have a lender, you don't know unless you talk to their and say, are you pre-qualified? What lender are you working with? Are you entitled to have something go towards closing? Because on Form 22A, I think it's on page 2, you have an option to have the seller pay so much percent towards closing. That's kind of what this is doing. And so it's going from the seller's obligation to pay the buyer brokerage firm by this addendum saying, okay, this amount of units is now going to go directly to the seller or the buyer at closing for the purposes of the lender. Now, that's where the relationship with you, with the lender, with the buyer is so important. That's early on in this process. So you have an open communication between your buyer and your buyer's lender and you. So this is another element that came in as I'm sitting here looking at what's going on, the dynamics of it. It's extremely important that that relationship is known, because otherwise, why check that box? Because it's not going to be cash back to them. It's going to go right back to me. Okay. So that's how that option would work. So if that is coming down now with that line 16, then the buyer lender determines the amount. So in my example, I say, so the escrow shall compensate 2 units to the buyer. The lender maximum was 3 units. And so that means I can say there's 3 units there, and then 2 are going to come back to me. Which means 10 of them that's coming in from the seller, the 10 that's coming in from the seller, and I am owed 5, that this extra 2 goes in, then I end up getting 7, and 3 went towards helping the closing of my buyer. It's kind of like pinball. I just, my brain was on pinball when I was making this matrix up. You can ask Marcia. And so there's the summary that 10 got spread by 7 and 3 in that example. So I said, all right. Now, if anybody can think of an example that I missed, let me know, because I was really trying to see if I could get them all. Here's one where you're drafting the PSA when the seller offers more than buyer compensation in the MLS. And the overage for the terms buyer firm's agency agreement on Form 41 says sellers offers 10 units and buyers 5 units. So here's the 10 and here's the 5. So what happens if we check the box on Form 41 when we negotiate our agreement that it's going to be a credit to the seller? The buyer decides that if there's anything over, we give it back to the seller. Maybe they can or offer less on the purchase price of the house. So make a note that when you're drafting the purchase and sale agreement, the excess funds transferred to the seller at closing is a negotiation element of the buyer's offer strategy. We got to be on our toes to know that, because when I'm talking to that listing broker, I want to make sure they understand these forms, because you want to understand them better than they do, because a lot of what we've seen in offers over the years being turned in is they don't always know as much as we do when we fill things out. You have to pay attention. So in that case, we'd be checking the box, pay as offered. You do not attach Form 41C. And on our form, looks like I lost my thing right here. Escrow is to distribute all closing costs per the contract instructions the seller offered to the buyer brokerage firm over the buyer agency agreement amount is returned to the seller at closing per the terms of the buyer agreement. In this case, you must make sure that you transmit the Form 41 to escrow for instructions on how to disperse the closing funds. So you have a mutual, because you didn't attach a Form 41C to this, right? You didn't attach it. When you turn into open app escrow, you've got to make sure that that Form 41 is sent to the escrow officer, because those are instructions for the terms of the purchase and sale agreement of how they're to be compensated. What's going to happen for paying those funds back to the seller at closing. So I think the other thing that we're looking at is we have escrow officers that need to figure out what we're doing with this thing too. Okay. So in example 7, what if they check the box as far as compensation from the seller? That would be item 5, item line 32. And that's where I might as well finish this off with it. So if I look at line 32, and here's 32, credit to the seller, when that escrow agent sees that that box is checked, that gives them the authority to make that disbursement and close. I said, beware at the time of drafting and negotiating the terms of other. This is the next example. I threw an example of another negotiation in here. And those leftover funds. Leftover funds were negotiated at the time the buyer and the buyer broker drafted the Form 41. No, this action is predetermined in Form 41 agreement. Buyer and the buyer broker agreed to split the seller compensation amount over the buyer's obligation owed. The remaining 5 units at closing will be dispersed 2.5 to 2.5. So in this example, what's happening is, since the seller's offered 10 and my obligation to be paid from the buyer was 5, that 5 that's left over, we pre-agreed to split between us. The thing we need to look out for is that 2.5 right there, is that if we don't know who the lender is, if the lender doesn't allow any payment to the buyer brokerage firm as a part of the loan, what happens to that money? And so all I'm saying here is that make sure that the non-allowable amount of funds by the lender are specified to go to the buyer brokerage firm. Be sure to include the language from item 5, line 31 through 32 in the terms of the other. Because then it's okay. If it ends up being a loan with the lender won't accept it, it defers back to the buyer broker's firm. But that would be a huge problem if you're trying to put funds someplace where they can't be received. So if there's anything in the other that's creative negotiations, I want to throw an example in there. If you do that, there could be some tripwires in there. Be very, very careful. Okay. So out of these examples that I have on here, I'm trying to look at anything that could possibly happen through the course of using Form 41C for things going to the brokerage firm, whether it's additional for buyer representing an agreement to get additional funds, whether it's a credit back to the buyer, whether it's a reduction of broker's compensation. Those are the only options that are available on this form for when you do that. And if an over amount, you don't need to use the form at all if whatever the seller's offering is greater than what the buyer's offering you. All right. Now, this is the time for your discussion.
Now,
Remember all that?
okay.
Okay. All right. So now we've gone through all the examples. You can have it over or under. You have variables going through that you can agree with the buyer. They're predetermined.
Yes.
And then you're trying to negotiate with the seller to get a deal for your client and also get paid. So where did you want to start your discussion?
I guess what I'm trying to, I'm trying to order my thoughts on how I am going to start. And I think where I see things going is if I have a listing and I know there are changes that can benefit the seller, and I'm gonna ask him to cover 4%, you know?
Okay.
Okay, so we have
4% for the sell side or the buy side?
I'm talking about, I guess my first question is, in your experience, what would you see happening from listing agents or on the selling side offering?
On the selling side, for the listing, talking to the seller, I would try to stay as close to what I'm saying today, other than saying there isn't any obligation for you to offer anything to the buyer broker. But our industry has been doing that for years, because if the buyer doesn't have professional representation, then we're going to have problems trying to get a negotiation for the sale of your house. Because you're trying to get the maximum price.
Yes.
They're trying to get the lowest price, and to avoid lowball offers, but offers that are reasonable for what the market is, where we can professionally work to a negotiation. I need to work with good brokers. You put a 0 in there, I don't know who we're going to get. There's people that got broker's license out of 90 hours of study that have only made 2 sales. One was to their mom and dad, and the other one was to their sister. And now all of a sudden, we don't know what they're going to do.
Yeah.
With these kind of a situation and what they're going to be asking. So, I mean, I guess you have to have some kind of comfort saying that if you offer something that is fairly reasonable out there,
yeah,
there may not be asking for you to chip in on that size, because that's what you can expect.
Mhm.
Because if they have a buyer that's going to only offer them 1%, they're going to be asking you to make up the difference. And if you say no to that, then the only other option is for the buyer broker to reduce the fee.
Now,
Listen,
Oh, I
Lisa.
get, when you're talking to
Lisa,
that,
you gotta kind of come up closer for the microphone.
when you're talking to that listing agent and you're discussing the forms and what's going on.
So
and
wait a second,
changes.
you're talking about as a buyer broker right now?
Yeah.
Okay. He's talking as a listing.
Oh,
broker
no,
right now.
the
Let me
list-
just,
no, the
are you
listing agent.
finished with the listing broker side?
I am.
No, it's,
Okay.
it's about
Well,
listing.
it's-
It's about the listing
Okay.
broker. On 41.5C, the filtering of listings, it says the buyer broker shall bring listings to the attention of the buyer, regardless of the amount of seller's offer of compensation, unless otherwise agreed to, set forth herein. So then if you check that, then,
You're in Anna Marie's territory, guys.
Then
Just
the
what
sell-
Anna Marie was talking about.
well, the seller then,
Because wait a second,
oh, okay,
what you're talking about, what
Yeah.
Lisa's talking about is filtering listings. Buyer broker shall bring listings to the attention of the buyer regardless of the amount the seller's offer of compensation, unless otherwise agreed to, set forth.
you're it.
And if you check that box,
Mhm.
I would reference an attachment A and then write down whatever that agreement is. So you have this form signed and that initialed and signed as your agreement. And they may ask you not to bring 0 listings to their attention.
Right, so.
So you can work that if you
So,
want. to.
yeah, so when you're talking to your seller your potential seller, that you're gonna work with, you can tell them right there, buyers have the choice
Yes,
of not seeing listings that have no compensation from the seller.
that is correct. That is a true statement that you can say that. If that there is an option, they can say that the buyer, broker and buyer have an option to have an agreement not to bring any offers
Right.
that are 0 or 1% or
So,
0.5%
I
or
mean,
something ridiculous.
if I was a seller, I'm gonna.
Yeah, keep that in mind.
Stick with the program.
Yeah.
That we've had.
But see, and this is, well, I'm glad you're doing this, is because I'm comfortable talking about that. But something, it was my first sale and my first buyer. I remember, that seems like it was yesterday when I first got my license. That really was uncomfortable. But
Yeah.
talking about it right now,
Yes.
we turn around logically, say, I'm a professional and I get paid for what I do. And I do a lot of things. You have no idea what I do behind the scenes. But I've gained a lot of experience in doing this, and I feel that I earn everything I get. But I really want to apply that towards helping you find and have a deal that you're happy with, either selling your house or whether you're buying. But I gotta be comfortable talking about it. And that's why the more we kick it around here and integrate it,
That is true.
talk it.
So when you do that, Tom, when you talk to a buyer, all right, and would you agree that, I mean, you know your value, but you're gonna try to find some middle ground for your buyer, knowing how the market is? Or how would you approach it? Because in my mind, I feel like the way my clients, are trying to get this money together, I'm like, okay, I need to put together something on my mind that makes sense for them, for me, and for the scenario that might arise. So let's say that, I tell them, you have to cover 2%, right? But in my mind, I know I'm worth 3. And I'm gonna try to stipulate that on the contract.
Well, I would ask them to stipulate that if my services are 3, I work for 3 units.
Uh-huh.
And you don't have 3 units to give me because you don't have enough just barely to cover your down payment and your closing costs. I want you to sign an agreement for 3. And the reason why is because unless you sign the contract mutually, you're at no risk. Okay. Now, the odds are we might have a seller that's making an offer for paying in the MLS, and you can see it just like I can, what they're paying, an offering on a property. And if they're offering a 3, then you're good. If they're offering a 4, we got to decide what to do with the extra. If they offer a 2, we have a gap of a 1. There's mechanisms for me to try and negotiate that with that seller at the time we write the offer. And if they sign that, then I got my 3. I worked for you and got there, and you didn't have to come up with that extra amount.
I see.
If it's a house you're just falling in love with and you're trying to squeeze and maybe you can throw a little bit back in, I might reduce my brokerage a little bit. If we can get the seller to chip in part and we chip in part, those are negotiations, but we can't use that right now. But I don't want to commit to working for nothing but for 2 for you and hope that that's over. By the time I use 5 gallon for gas for 5 gallon, we're driving around looking at houses. And if I'm selling land, I'm driving up Union Valley. I can't go broke.
Yeah.
I can't stay in business. Somehow or other, I got to try and get that through.
Okay.
That's only fair.
Yeah.
And I'll knock myself out trying to help you get that exactly what you're looking for. Which, if you have 10 things, you're only going to get 7 because you never get all 10, but we'll get as close as we can. Okay.
Nice.
I think that was well said.
That's good.
What do you think about presenting your buyer's offer in person to the sellers?
I think you're doing the same thing we're talking about right now, but because the first person you have to sell is the listing broker, if I'm the buyer broker, because if I don't give them the ammunition and the logic of why I packaged it the way it is, then because if I am trying to ask for that and I turn around and say these are great people, they're solid, they're going to get that loan, but they don't have the extra cash to come up for the compensation on the broker side, so we're asking for the seller to make up that difference. But we got a good offer in. They're a solid buyer. They love the house. And so that's how we're framing our offer and why we're presenting it, asking the seller to close that gap for us. I mean, they've got to convince them that it's a good deal for that seller.
But I'm saying if you're the buyer's agent, you go in and you say to the listing agent,
So
I would like to come in and present this in person.
Or you could do that, but I mean, whether it's on the phone or in person, just don't text message or email. I mean, if you have to use all your skills, and if you do it in person, I mean, you're going to use all your personal power and skills to really sell that listing broker. So they represent that offer to the seller. And the odds are, it's like any offer. It's the same thing. We're doing that every time we make an offer. And we always seem to be content on how we package. We always anticipate having a counter offer. And then many times we put a counter offer back to the counter offer. But every time we do that, as I'm talking with, what we're just talking about here, is that buyer doesn't have to feel like they're at risk, because if they don't sign mutual, we can keep looking for other property. But if the market's shifting, so that seller all of a sudden right now they have been in the driver's seat for so many years, but you know, with the shifting market right now, they're looking at having to drop prices. They're trying to find buyers because it's hard to get a loan. So it seems to me if I come in right now and I'm asking for them to pay the gap out of what their profits are off that house to make that sale, if they can get that sale, I think we're in a better position today than we were a year ago. Okay, I've gone way over. Before I do anything else, people out in Zoom land, is there any feedback or questions, or how you doing out there? We're getting ready to wrap up.
No, just thanks so much for the extra time. It was really good, really good.
Yes, thank
Thank
you
you.
for all the information.
Okay, and I'll package all of this up. And as you know, Marcia and I are open for phone calls and emails, anything we can do to help you guys out. Just let us know.
Thank you, Tom. We really appreciate all this work you put into this. It's a lot of
Yeah,
work.
you both are our gift. You're both our gift to our office.
You are.
When I stopped and saw him yesterday, his brain was on